A maid with a hidden past was arrested after secretly breaking multiple laws in a desperate attempt to save the life of a billionaire's only son. A sick child everyone else had already given up on. And as the media turned her into a national controversy, experts, prosecutors, and the public demanded punishment. Until the final day in court arrived, when one moment, one unexpected action, and one powerful decision from the judge changed everything in a way that no one in the room or watching from across the country ever saw coming. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. The Whitmore mansion was large, elegant, and filled with the most expensive things money could buy. Every room had rare furniture, shining floors, and artwork that most people only see in museums. But even with all this wealth, the house felt cold and empty. Charles Whitmore, a billionaire who owned one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, lived there with his young son, Ethan. Ethan was only 6 years old and had been very sick since birth. He had chronic kidney failure, a serious condition that required constant care. Charles had lost his wife, Karen, during Ethan's birth. Since then, he buried himself in work, running his empire with strict discipline, trying to ignore the pain inside. He didn't know how to show love or affection anymore. Ethan grew up mostly alone, surrounded by staff who changed often. No one stayed long. He rarely smiled or played. His life was limited to medical routines and quiet sadness, trapped in a home that lacked real warmth. Charles spent most of his time in his office or at the company headquarters, attending meetings and making decisions worth millions. At home, he barely saw Ethan. He believed giving his son the best medical care was enough. But in reality, what Ethan needed most was attention, comfort, and someone to truly care. Nurses came and went, doing their jobs without building any real connection with the boy. The house was more like a hospital than a home. Ethan's room was filled with machines, medications, and silence. He didn't have friends. He didn't go to school. Every day felt the same. Sometimes he stared out the window for hours. Charles had all the resources, but none of them could bring back Karen or heal the pain in Ethan's body and heart. When doctors tried different treatments, nothing worked. Every option failed. It was clear that Ethan's health was getting worse, and time was running out faster than anyone wanted to admit. One morning, during another routine checkup at home, the lead doctor sat down with Charles and delivered the news in a serious voice. "Your son needs a kidney transplant as soon as possible," he said. Charles was shocked. Until then, he had believed the expensive treatments and hospital visits were enough. He didn't fully understand the danger Ethan was in. The doctor explained that Ethan's condition had reached a point where no medication or dialysis could help anymore. Only a transplant could save him now. Charles asked to be tested immediately, but results showed he wasn't a match. That hit him hard. He had never felt so powerless. There were no close relatives from Karen's side either. No cousins, no aunts, no uncles. It was just Charles and Ethan now, facing something terrifying. The process of searching for a donor would be long and uncertain. Time was critical, but there was no guarantee they would find someone in time. The situation had become desperate. As the days passed, Charles began to feel emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Guilt, sadness, fear. He remembered Karen's face, her laugh, and the way she used to hold Ethan as a baby. He realized how distant he had been from his son, focusing on work instead of building memories. Now that Ethan was slipping away, Charles finally saw how much he had missed. He tried to spend more time with him, sitting by his bed, reading to him, or simply holding his hand. Ethan was weak, but noticed the change. For the first time in a long while, there was a small connection between them, but it was too late to undo the past. The medical team continued to monitor Ethan closely, adjusting machines and medication. Still, nothing changed the fact that his body was failing. Charles ordered his staff to start a national donor search, using every contact, every favor, every resource. But the process was slow and uncertain. Charles couldn't sleep. At night, he walked through the hallways of the mansion, thinking about everything. The empire he built didn't matter anymore. The money, the success, the respect, all of it felt meaningless now. He had always believed he could fix anything if he worked hard enough or paid the right amount. But this wasn't something he could control. Ethan's quiet suffering haunted him. The house, once filled with pride and power, now felt like a prison. He started avoiding the office, staying home more, watching over Ethan. The staff noticed the change in him. He was quieter, more serious. When he talked to the doctors, he asked many questions, trying to understand everything. But no matter how much he tried, the answer remained the same. Without a compatible kidney, Ethan would not survive. It was a painful truth that grew heavier every day. The deadline was invisible, but it was coming, and Charles knew it was getting closer. Then came the moment that confirmed the fear Charles had been trying to ignore. During a scheduled visit, the doctor returned with the latest test results and calmly repeated the message. He needs a kidney. Urgently, it was not a suggestion. It was a warning, a fact. There were no other options left. Charles sat down, his hands trembling. Ethan lay quietly in his bed, unaware of how close he was to the edge. The medical team stood nearby, waiting for instructions. Charles looked at them, then back at his son. The weight of failure crushed him. He had built an empire but could not save his own child. The silence in the room was heavy. This was no longer a problem that money could solve easily. It was a race against time, and it had already started without anyone noticing. A quiet, cruel race with no finish line in sight. Only one thing was certain: it could not be ignored anymore. It was on a rainy morning that Claire Thompson arrived at the Whitmore mansion. The sky was grey, the driveway was wet, and her old umbrella barely held up against the wind. She stepped out of the car sent by the agency with a single suitcase in hand and walked up to the front door. Claire had been hired quietly as the new housekeeper, and no one in the mansion paid much attention to her at first. She was a quiet woman, spoke gently, and didn't demand anything from anyone. Her hands were rough from years of work, and her clothes were simple. Still, there was something warm about her presence. The staff gave her a short introduction to her duties, and she nodded politely. Her room was small, tucked away in a corner of the house, but she didn't seem to mind. While the house felt cold and formal, Claire seemed calm. She didn't come for the luxury. She came for something else, though she didn't say what. In the first few days, Claire focused on learning her tasks. She cleaned, organized, and helped in the kitchen. She didn't talk much, but when she did, her voice was calm and friendly. What surprised everyone was how naturally she connected with Ethan. While most staff kept their distance, Claire approached him slowly, respecting his silence. She sat with him during meals, brought him small snacks, and read to him before bedtime. She never forced conversation. Instead, she simply stayed, and that made Ethan feel safe. Within a few days, the boy, who barely spoke to anyone, started to look for her. He smiled when she entered the room and asked her to stay longer after the stories. No one else had been able to reach him like that. Even the nurses noticed the difference. Claire was kind, patient, and gentle. Her way of caring wasn't part of the job. It was real. Ethan could feel it, and that made all the difference. Charles began to notice changes, even if he didn't say much. He saw Ethan smiling more, speaking more, and sleeping better. At first, he thought maybe the boy's medication had been adjusted, but the doctors said nothing had changed. When he asked the nurses, they simply pointed to Claire. Charles didn't understand how someone so new could have such an effect. He started observing her from a distance. He noticed the way she listened to Ethan, how she paid attention to his routines, how she responded when he had bad days. She never lost patience. She treated him like a person, not a task. Charles felt both grateful and confused. He wasn't used to someone making a difference in his house without asking for anything in return. Claire didn't try to impress him. She wasn't interested in pleasing the boss. Her focus was always on Ethan. That honesty stood out in a place where most people only cared about doing their job and leaving when the clock said so. As days passed, Claire became an important part of the mansion. She helped organize Ethan's appointments, prepared light meals he liked, and even reminded the nurses about small details in his routine. Everyone began to rely on her presence. But while Claire gave so much to others, no one really knew her. She rarely talked about her past. When asked, she changed the subject or gave short answers. At night, when the house was quiet, she sat alone and looked out her window with sad eyes. She kept a photo hidden in her room, and sometimes she would quietly cry while holding it. No one saw that side of her. To the rest of the house, Claire was strong and steady, but inside she carried pain that she didn't share. Still, even with her private sorrow, she always showed up for Ethan. Whatever pain she held inside, she used it to be more present for the boy. It was clear that she cared deeply. Claire paid close attention to every medical report about Ethan. When the doctors spoke, she listened carefully. She wrote down things, asked questions when no one else did, and tried to understand everything about his condition. Whenever a new test came in, she reviewed it quietly, her eyes filled with concern. The nurses assumed she was just being thorough, but there was more to it. Every update about Ethan's health hit her personally. She looked at his numbers and charts as if they belonged to someone she once knew. But she kept her emotions hidden. She didn't want anyone to notice. Still, her behavior made some people curious. Why was she so invested? Why did she always look so hurt after hearing the test results? But no one dared to ask. Claire kept her past locked inside. She wasn't there just to clean and cook. She had a reason to be close to Ethan, even if no one knew what it was. Her pain had a story. Fate had brought Claire and Ethan into the same house, and something about that didn't feel random. Even if no one could explain it, there was a sense that their lives had crossed for a reason. Claire brought something to Ethan that no treatment, no nurse, and no doctor had been able to provide. She gave him real comfort, steady care, and the feeling of being loved. In return, being close to Ethan gave Claire something she had been missing too. She never said it out loud, but it was clear that being around him helped her feel less alone. There was a connection between them that went beyond words. Charles didn't understand it fully, but even he started to trust her. He allowed her to take on more responsibility without asking questions. No one yet knew what Claire had lived through or what pain she still carried. But one thing was certain: her arrival was not just an accident. Everything was about to change, and it had already started. Without telling anyone, Claire decided to take action on her own. She knew Ethan's situation was critical, and she couldn't sit back and wait any longer. One night, after everyone was asleep, she quietly took Ethan's medical files and copied the necessary information. A few days later, she visited a private clinic in another part of the city. There, she told the doctors she wanted to take compatibility tests, but asked for complete discretion. She didn't use her full name and made sure not to mention the Whitmore family. The results came back quickly. She was a perfect match. Her heart beat faster when she saw the paper. She sat in silence, holding the report, knowing exactly what she would do next. Claire didn't tell Charles. She didn't tell the nurses. She didn't even write anything down at home. Her decision was final. She would donate her kidney to Ethan, and she would do it without anyone knowing it was her. That was the only way she wanted it. Claire returned to the same clinic and asked to start the process immediately. She signed all the papers under a false identity and told the doctors she wished to stay anonymous. even after the transplant. The staff at the clinic agreed to her request. They arranged everything with care. The surgery would be scheduled quietly, and her name would never be linked to the boy's file. Claire said she didn't want any attention. Her only goal was to help the child. She kept working at the mansion during the preparations, hiding her stress and physical discomfort. When the date was set, she packed a small bag and left without giving anyone a clear explanation. She said she needed to take some personal time for health reasons. Then she went straight to the clinic. The surgery was done early in the morning. Everything went well. Claire stayed at the clinic afterward to recover. She felt weak, tired and sore, but deep down she was calm. She had done the right thing. 2 full weeks passed, and no one at the mansion had clear answers. Claire didn't call, and the staff assumed her health issue was serious. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Ethan began to recover in a way that shocked the doctors. His body accepted the new kidney with no complications. The medical team described it as a perfect match and almost too good to be true. Charles was informed that the donor had chosen to stay anonymous. He was told there was no way to contact the person. All he could do was be thankful. Charles was confused and emotional, watching his son slowly return to life. Ethan had more energy, started eating better, and smiled more each day. The nurses were amazed. The change was fast and clear. But while the media started talking about a miracle recovery, Claire remained silent in her hospital bed, healing. She refused all calls from the clinic and avoided watching the news. She didn't want praise. She had done it for Ethan. When Claire finally returned to the mansion, she looked thinner and pale. She moved slowly and said she had gone through a personal health problem. Nobody asked too many questions. Charles welcomed her back politely, and the staff returned to their routines. But Ethan's reaction was different. As soon as he saw Claire again, he smiled wide and ran to her. He hugged her tightly, something he had never done before. Then, with a soft voice, he called her Mommy. Claire froze for a second, shocked, but then hugged him back. She didn't correct him. Tears filled her eyes, but she wiped them quickly before anyone noticed. That word meant everything to her. She had lost someone once, and now, in some way, Ethan had given her a new purpose. Claire returned to her duties, still quiet and calm. But now, her connection with Ethan was stronger than ever. The bond between them was no longer just emotional. It was now physical too. Part of her was inside him. Charles watched the two of them more closely after that. He couldn't ignore the change. Claire looked fragile, but focused. Ethan was brighter and more alive every day. At first, Charles was just happy to see his son healthy, but something started to bother him. The timing of Claire's disappearance and the sudden arrival of the anonymous donor felt too close to be a coincidence. Charles began thinking more deeply. He asked the clinic for details about the donor, but they refused to release any information. He called in favors and asked people in private hospitals if they had heard anything. Slowly, he started putting the pieces together. He noticed Claire's subtle discomfort, how she avoided certain tasks, and how protective she had become of Ethan. The answers weren't clear yet, but his instincts told him something important had happened, and that Claire was at the center of it. Meanwhile, the media kept calling it a mystery. Headlines called it a case of medical luck. But Charles had doubts, even with the public calling it a miracle and the hospital keeping the donor's identity a secret. Charles couldn't stop thinking about it. He kept asking quiet questions and looking through records. Every time he hit a wall, his suspicion grew. Meanwhile, Claire continued her work as if nothing had changed. She never brought up her absence, and she avoided any mention of the transplant. She stayed by Ethan's side, helping with his routines and cheering up his days. Ethan was getting stronger, laughing more, and slowly going back to being a regular boy. But the truth, the real truth, was hanging in the air, like a weight. Charles could feel it. He didn't want to believe that someone would go that far in silence. He didn't want to admit that the woman he barely noticed at first might have saved his son's life without asking for anything in return. But deep down, he knew. And that truth, no matter how carefully hidden, wouldn't stay buried forever. Claire's silence started to draw attention. For weeks, she had avoided answering questions about where she had been during her sudden absence. She kept working at the Whitmore mansion like everything was normal. But at the hospital, things were not so quiet. Administrators had been reviewing the transplant case because some of the donor documents didn't look right. They tried contacting the listed donor, but the name and contact details led nowhere. The ID used was fake. The hospital had strict rules, and everything about this case was beginning to look suspicious. The medical team, although impressed by the results, couldn't explain how such a perfect match had been made without going through the regular donor system. So, the administration made a decision. They contacted the police. A quiet investigation was launched. Officers began looking into the hospital records and searching for any sign of fraud. Claire had no idea that people were now watching her closely, and that her carefully kept secret was about to be exposed. Not long after, Claire received a formal letter calling her in for questioning. She was told to appear at a nearby police station to give a statement related to the anonymous kidney donation. When she arrived, she tried to remain calm, but she was clearly nervous. Inside the room, the investigators asked simple questions at first, about her job, her background, and where she had been during her 2-week absence. Claire said very little. She claimed she had been sick and recovering at a private clinic. She denied any connection to the donor. But the police already had doubts. They had found inconsistencies in the hospital files and discovered that the fake name used for the transplant was connected to a burner phone paid in cash. They asked for a DNA sample to compare with the donor tissue. Claire refused at first, but the authorities got a court order. The sample was taken. A few days later, the results came back. It was a match. Claire had donated the kidney. When Charles was informed about the investigation results, he was shocked. At first, he didn't know what to say. But as the full truth was revealed, that Claire had used false documents, a fake name, and undergone major surgery without proper authorization, his shock turned to anger. He didn't blame her for helping Ethan. In fact, he knew that her sacrifice had saved his son's life. But what infuriated him was that she had done it all in secret outside the law and without thinking about the consequences. Claire had risked her life. If anything had gone wrong, no one would have been able to help her. Charles felt betrayed. He had trusted her in his home and around his child, and now he discovered that she had broken serious laws without telling anyone. That same day, Charles made a painful decision. He called Claire into his office. His words were short and direct. He thanked her for what she had done, but told her she was fired. The media got hold of the story within hours. News outlets across the country exploded with headlines. Mansion Maid behind secret kidney transplant. Woman uses fake identity to save boy's life. Illegal donor scandal rocks Whitmore family. Reporters gathered outside the mansion. Cameras pointed at every car that came in or out. Journalists shouted questions at the gates. The family's lawyers refused to comment, but that didn't stop the coverage. People online took sides quickly. Some praised Claire as a hero, others called her irresponsible and reckless. Talk shows debated whether her actions were brave or criminal. Ethan's recovery, once seen as a medical miracle, was now part of a legal scandal. The hospital issued a statement saying they were cooperating fully with the investigation. They also began reviewing their security protocols. Claire, meanwhile, stayed quiet. She didn't speak to reporters. She didn't post anything online. She returned to a small apartment and waited for her legal situation to unfold, now completely alone again. Soon after, Claire was formally charged in court. The accusations were serious. She was accused of falsifying identity documents, using a false name to access a medical procedure, and participating in a transplant without following legal procedures. The term used was illegal medical practice. The court said that even though the transplant helped save a life, it was still done outside the law. The judge also mentioned that if the operation had gone wrong, the hospital would have had no way to track or treat her. Claire's lawyer tried to argue that she acted out of love and desperation, not selfishness or profit, but the legal system did not work based on emotions. The law had been broken. Claire faced fines, possible prison time, and a permanent criminal record. She sat quietly in court, avoiding eye contact with the crowd. The courtroom was full. Reporters filled every row. Every word said that day would be written, repeated, and shared across every screen in the country by nightfall. Back at the mansion, the atmosphere had changed completely. Charles avoided public comments, but people close to him noticed he was restless. Ethan asked about Claire every day. He didn't understand what had happened, only that she was gone. Charles struggled to explain. He didn't want to lie to his son, but he also couldn't tell him everything. Meanwhile, lawyers worked day and night to manage the media, protect the company's name, and distance the Whitmore brand from the scandal. Still, damage had been done. Investors were asking questions. News anchors continued to follow every step of the case. And Claire, who once quietly walked the mansion halls, had become the center of national debate. People talked about her on the streets, in offices, and in homes across the country. The story wasn't just about a kidney anymore. It was about law, sacrifice, and ethics. And even though Claire had disappeared from public view, the truth she had tried so hard to hide was now everywhere. Impossible to ignore. Claire was arrested. The news broke early in the morning. 2 police officers arrived at her apartment with a warrant and handcuffs. She didn't resist. She quietly followed them out, keeping her head down as neighbors watched. At the police station, she was processed like anyone else, fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a small cell. The media caught everything. Cameras outside the building filmed the whole scene. Reporters shouted questions she didn't answer. Within hours, her face was all over the news. Online platforms replayed the arrest footage on a loop. News anchors discussed every detail. At the Whitmore mansion, Ethan cried when he heard Claire had been taken away. He didn't understand what was happening. He refused to eat, asking over and over when his real mom would come back. The nurses didn't know what to say. Charles tried to comfort him, but Ethan didn't want anyone else. The woman who had saved his life was gone, and he couldn't understand why no one was helping her. Across the country, the story was everywhere. Every news outlet, website, and radio show talked about Claire Thompson. Some reporters focused on the legal charges: identity fraud, illegal medical practice, and false documentation. Others dug into her background, trying to find out who she really was. Talk shows invited doctors, lawyers, and moral experts to give their opinions. Some called her brave, others reckless. Online, people argued non-stop. Hashtags spread across social media. Supporters called for her release, while critics said laws must be followed, even when intentions are good. Outside the courthouse, protests began. Some carried signs that said, "Let Claire go," while others shouted that she had broken the law. Meanwhile, Claire stayed in jail. She didn't talk to reporters. She didn't ask for special treatment. Her silence made her harder to read. She was assigned a public defender, a lawyer provided by the government, but even he struggled to get answers from her. Claire barely spoke, spending most of her time sitting alone, head down. Inside the cell, Claire felt tired. The walls were grey and cold, the bed hard. The food was plain, and the lights stayed on even at night. She didn't complain. She followed the rules, said yes or no when needed, and avoided fights with other inmates. She thought about Ethan constantly, wondering if he was okay, but she had no way of knowing. Her lawyer visited a few times, trying to prepare her for court, but he didn't understand her completely. He asked her to speak more, to give a clear story they could use in her defense. But Claire stayed quiet. She didn't want to explain everything. She believed that if she had to suffer to keep Ethan safe, then she would. The lawyer warned her the case looked bad. The evidence, fake documents, medical records, and DNA tests, was solid. No one questioned her role in the transplant anymore. The problem was how she had done it. That was what the law cared about, not her reasons. Back in the mansion, things were falling apart in a different way. Ethan's health was stable, but emotionally, he was slipping. He barely spoke. He refused to play or eat normally. The only word he said often was, "Mommy." Nurses tried to distract him, bringing books or games, but nothing worked. Charles kept a close eye on him but didn't know how to help. At the same time, he was dealing with pressure from all sides. The pharmaceutical company was under scrutiny. Shareholders wanted answers. They were worried about the company's image. Customers had started sending complaints, saying they couldn't trust a company involved in such a scandal. Charles had to act calm in public, releasing short statements and holding private meetings. But inside, he was restless. He couldn't stop thinking about Ethan's words. "She saved me." Those words repeated in his mind every night. He didn't care about rules or public opinion in those moments. He thought only about the woman who had risked everything for his son. The trial date was finally set. Claire would stand in court in just a few weeks. The prosecutors were preparing a strong case. They had all the documents, video footage from the clinic, and even witness statements. They were not going to be soft just because the case was emotional. The law was clear, they said. No one could use false information for medical procedures. Claire had bypassed every legal system in place. She had signed forms under a fake name, lied to medical professionals, and taken part in a transplant that should have gone through government channels. Claire didn't deny it. She admitted what she had done, but she refused to explain why. The courtroom would be filled. Reporters were already planning coverage. News outlets prepared headlines. Everyone was waiting for the day. Claire would face it all alone. No family, no friends in the courtroom, no letters of support. She had given everything for Ethan. Now she would have to deal with the price of her decision. The stage was set for the most painful chapter of her story. Claire sat in her cell, knowing the trial was close. She had no more moves to make. Her actions were clear. There was no way to undo them. Ethan, still waiting for her, didn't understand why someone who loved him was being treated like a criminal. Charles watched everything unfold in silence, torn between legal responsibility and personal guilt. The company demanded one thing, but his heart whispered something else. He thought of the night Claire returned from the hospital, looking pale and weak. He remembered the way Ethan had hugged her and said, "Mommy." That memory wouldn't go away, but now it was too late. The legal machine was moving forward. The courtroom was ready. The lawyers were ready. The country was watching. Claire Thompson, once a quiet housekeeper, was now at the center of a national scandal, and nothing could stop what was coming next. The story was no longer private. It belonged to the world. Inside the courtroom, all eyes were on the entrance as Claire walked in, wearing handcuffs. Two officers guided her down the aisle while dozens of people stared. The front rows were filled with reporters, company representatives, and members of the public, many of them from wealthy families who had followed the Whitmore story from the beginning. Their expressions showed disgust, anger, or curiosity. Cameras flashed constantly, and the noise of shutters clicking filled the room. Claire kept her head down, avoiding eye contact. She looked tired, thin, and worn out. She wore the plain clothes given to her in jail. There was no makeup, no jewelry, nothing that reminded anyone of the woman who once read stories to Ethan. On the judge's bench sat a serious man with a strict expression. He didn't smile. As Claire took her seat with her public defender beside her, the silence in the room grew heavier. Everyone waited for the trial to begin, unsure of what would happen next. The prosecutor stood up and began his opening argument. He spoke loudly and clearly, making sure everyone could hear. He described Claire as someone who had broken the law in several ways. He said she was reckless, selfish, and acted without thinking about the consequences. He repeated that she had used a false name, provided fake documents, and gone through a medical procedure without following legal protocols. According to him, Claire had placed her own emotions above public safety. He told the jury that even though the result was positive, Ethan's life was saved. It didn't change the fact that a crime had been committed. He warned them not to let feelings cloud their judgment. The law, he said, existed to protect everyone, and no one was above it. Claire sat still, not reacting to his words. Her lawyer tried to respond, but his voice was softer, less confident. He asked the jury to consider Claire's reasons, but he didn't have much to work with. Claire still hadn't spoken. The judge asked Claire to rise. It was time for her testimony. The courtroom became completely quiet. People leaned forward in their seats. Claire stood up slowly. She looked around the room for a second, then faced the judge. Her hands were shaking, but she began to speak. Her voice was low at first, but steady. She told the court that years ago, she had a daughter, a young girl who had suffered from kidney failure, just like Ethan. Claire explained how she had worked hard, but could not afford the expensive treatments. She said she watched her daughter get weaker every day until she died in her arms. Claire paused to hold back tears. Then she said that when she saw Ethan, she felt the same fear. She couldn't let another child die, not when she could do something about it. She knew the risks. She knew it was illegal. But she chose to act because she couldn't live with herself if she stayed silent again. As Claire spoke, the courtroom changed. The mood was no longer cold and harsh. People began to look at her differently. Several members of the jury looked down or wiped their eyes. Even some of the reporters stopped writing and just listened. Claire continued, explaining that she didn't want praise, money, or attention. That's why she had hidden everything. She only wanted to save Ethan. She said she believed a system that lets rich children live and poor ones die is already broken. She didn't want to break the law. She just didn't want to lose another child. Her voice cracked, but she finished her story. When she sat down again, the room stayed silent for a long moment. The prosecutor stood up again. He didn't show emotion. He simply repeated his point. A crime is still a crime. He reminded the court that personal feelings should not decide justice. His words were cold but clear. The law didn't bend for personal stories, he said. Not even this one. After all the statements were finished, the judge gave instructions to the jury. He reminded them that their job was to decide based on the law, not on emotion. The jury then left the room to begin deliberating. It could take hours, maybe even days. Claire was taken back to a small holding room to wait. Outside the courtroom, crowds gathered. Some people held signs supporting Claire. Others held signs demanding justice and punishment. News channels set up cameras and broadcast live updates. Online, the trial was trending. Social media exploded with debates. Some people called her a hero. Others said she had no right to do what she did. People argued in comments, videos, and articles. The courtroom stayed locked. No one knew how long the jury would take. Inside, Charles waited silently. He had attended every part of the trial, but had said nothing publicly. Next to him, Ethan had stayed home, too young to understand everything, but still asking about Claire every night. The world held its breath. The jury had not yet returned, but the weight of their decision was already being felt. Reporters refreshed their phones. Lawyers waited with their notes ready. Security guards stood by the doors. Inside the jury room, 12 people were trying to decide whether Claire was guilty of breaking the law, and if so, what her punishment should be. Outside, it felt like the entire country was watching. No one knew which way the verdict would go. Some believed the jury would show mercy, others believed the court would make an example of her. Claire sat alone in the back room, staring at the floor, hands folded in her lap. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She had said everything she needed to say. Now her fate rested in the hands of strangers. The courtroom remained silent. The judge remained still. And somewhere across the country, people watched their screens, waiting. The jury was still out. And the whole nation was holding its breath. Just before the jury returned with the final verdict, something completely unexpected happened. The courtroom was full and tense. People stood in silence, waiting. The door suddenly burst open and Ethan ran inside. The bailiff tried to stop him, but he was too fast. He ran straight across the courtroom, past lawyers and reporters, until he reached Claire. Without saying anything, he hugged her tightly. She knelt down, holding him back, surprised and emotional. Tears were already running down his face when he looked up and shouted loud enough for the whole courtroom to hear, "You did right, Mommy." The room froze. People gasped. Some covered their mouths. Even the judge looked taken aback. Ethan kept holding Claire, refusing to let go. The security guards hesitated, unsure what to do. Everyone could see the boy's emotion was real. No one had told him what to say. It came from his heart. That moment hit the room harder than any argument the lawyers had made all day. Charles, who had been silent through most of the trial, stood up from his seat. His face looked different, tired, emotional, broken. He walked slowly toward the front of the courtroom and asked the judge for permission to speak. The judge allowed it. Charles turned to face the people in the room. He looked at Claire, then at Ethan, who was still in her arms. His voice shook as he began to speak. He admitted that he had made mistakes, big ones. He said he had been a coward for not defending Claire from the beginning. He admitted that he had cared more about public image and business than about the truth. Charles said that Claire had done something he couldn't do, not even with all the money he had. She had given Ethan love, she had given him life, and she had done it without asking for anything. He looked at the judge and said, "If saving my son's life is a crime, then I'm guilty too." He objected to what Charles was saying. He said emotions were running too high and that the court needed to stay focused on the law. He repeated that Claire had committed serious crimes and that no amount of public sympathy could change that. But the room was no longer with him. The crowd wasn't shouting or protesting, but their silence said everything. People had tears in their eyes. Reporters had stopped taking notes. Even the jury members seemed moved. Claire's defense lawyer stood and made one last request. He asked for a full pardon, a legal amnesty, based on extraordinary circumstances. He argued that Claire's actions, while illegal, had saved a life and came from a place of love and sacrifice. He reminded the judge that justice was not just about punishment, but also about understanding the full story. He asked the court to look not just at the law, but at the people affected by it. The judge took a long pause. He looked around the courtroom and said that the law was strict, but it also allowed room for context. He reminded everyone that judges had the duty to weigh facts, evidence, and human impact. He said he would take a short recess to review everything again before announcing the final decision. While he left the room, no one sat down. The crowd stayed on their feet. Claire sat quietly, holding Ethan's hand. Her eyes were red, but she was calm. Charles sat down again, staring at the floor. The reporters whispered to one another, preparing for a possible twist. Outside the courtroom, crowds gathered waiting for any news. Cameras were ready. Social media had already exploded with videos of Ethan's dramatic entrance. Inside, No one knew what the judge would decide. But something had changed. The trial was no longer just about rules. It had become about people, about life, love, and how far someone could go to protect what they cared about. After a long wait, the judge returned. Everyone stood up. The room was silent. The judge looked directly at Claire. He spoke clearly and calmly. "Considering all the facts," he said, "this court declares Claire Thompson innocent of all formal charges." For a moment, no one moved. Then the room erupted. People began to cheer. Some clapped, others cried. Reporters rushed to send the news out. Cameras captured every second. Claire stood still for a moment, stunned. Then Ethan hugged her again, tighter than before. Charles walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. He didn't say anything, but the look on his face said enough. The judge asked for order in the courtroom, but his voice was lost in the noise. The prosecution team looked shocked, but said nothing. Claire's lawyer exhaled deeply, overwhelmed with relief. It was over. She was free. The risk she had taken, the pain she had endured, it had all led to this moment. A room full of people had just witnessed justice with heart. Outside the courthouse, the news spread fast. People cheered in the streets. Claire and Ethan walked out together, holding hands, with Charles following behind them. Cameras followed every step, but this time, no one tried to hide. Claire wasn't a criminal anymore. She wasn't just a maid or a mystery woman. She was someone who had made a choice, and that choice had changed everything. Her story had reached the whole country, and now it was changing how people thought about law, sacrifice, and family. News anchors called it the trial that changed a nation. Commentators said the verdict would be remembered for years. But Claire didn't care about the headlines. She only cared that Ethan was safe. As they got into the car, Ethan looked at her and smiled. "We're going home now, right?" he asked. Claire nodded, her voice soft. "Yes, we are." Around them, people continued cheering, but for Claire, the only thing that mattered was holding Ethan's hand and knowing he was still alive. Free at last, Claire collapsed to the floor of the courtroom, still holding Ethan tightly in her arms. She didn't care about the cameras, the people watching, or the noise around her. Her body gave up for a moment, and she cried openly. Ethan hugged her just as tightly, refusing to let go. His small hands gripped her back, and he whispered, "You're really staying, right?" Claire nodded, unable to speak. The entire room watched in silence. Nobody moved. A woman who had entered the court in handcuffs just hours ago was now on the floor, surrounded by support and emotion. Some people cried, others clapped again. Even court officers stepped aside, giving her space. For the first time in a long while, Claire didn't feel alone. She didn't feel like a criminal or just a caretaker. She felt human, and with Ethan in her arms, she felt whole. That moment wasn't about winning. It was about finally being seen, finally being safe, and finally being free. Outside the courtroom, the media was already rewriting the narrative. Just days before, they had called Claire a criminal, a fraud, even dangerous. Now, headlines used words like hero, mother, and example of true love. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse for interviews, but Claire didn't speak to any of them. She just held Ethan's hand and walked with him to the car. That night, major news channels told her story in detail. Talk shows invited legal experts to discuss the unusual but powerful trial. Crowdfunding platforms exploded with activity. Thousands of people donated to help Claire rebuild her life. Some offered housing, others offered jobs. One campaign simply said, "Let's give something back to the woman who gave everything." Within a few days, enough money was raised to support her and Ethan for years. People from across the country and even other countries left messages saying they were moved by her story. Claire didn't ask for any of it, but this time the world gave without her needing to. Charles also went public. In a formal press conference, wearing a dark suit and standing in front of the Whitmore Company logo, he addressed the public directly. His voice was steady, but his words were humble. He admitted his mistakes. He said he had failed, not just as a businessman, but as a father and a human being. He told the press that Claire had given Ethan something no amount of money or medicine could provide: real love. Then, with emotion in his voice, he asked for her forgiveness. He also made an announcement. He offered Claire a permanent role in Ethan's life, not as an employee, but as his legal guardian and tutor. There's no teacher, no nanny, no doctor in the world who could raise Ethan better than the woman who saved him, Charles said. The news spread fast and people responded positively. It was a powerful moment, a billionaire admitting his failures and lifting up the woman he had once fired in anger and fear. Claire didn't respond immediately. She was overwhelmed by everything. The court victory, the sudden fame, the money, the public support, and now Charles's offer. She didn't want to make decisions in the middle of so much noise. Her first instinct was to say no. She didn't want to live in a mansion or take on a formal title. She just wanted peace. But that evening, as she packed some of her things at the temporary place she had been staying, Ethan sat beside her. He was quiet, holding one of the drawings he had made, a picture of them together, labeled "Mommy and Me." After a few minutes, he looked at her and said, "Please stay. Please be my mommy." Claire didn't answer right away. He repeated it, "Please, mommy." His voice cracked a little. She looked at him, saw the honesty in his eyes, and finally nodded. She hugged him tightly, holding back her tears. It wasn't just a decision anymore, it was a choice of the heart. With Ethan's clear desire and Charles's full support, Claire and her lawyer returned to court days later. This time, it wasn't for a trial, but for a request: legal recognition of Claire as Ethan's mother. The court reviewed her case, including her actions, the bond between them, and Ethan's own words. The judge who had once declared her innocent now listened again, this time with less tension in the room. Social workers confirmed that Ethan had never shown a connection like this with anyone else. The psychologist who had observed him said the child viewed Claire as his true mother, not just emotionally, but completely. Claire herself stayed quiet most of the time, but when asked, she simply said, "I will take care of him for the rest of my life. That's all I want." After some time, the judge gave his decision. The court approved the emotional adoption. Claire Thompson was now, officially and legally, Ethan's mother. The courtroom applauded again, this time with peace instead of shock. Claire was no longer just the woman who saved a boy's life. She was no longer a headline or a name in a legal case. She was now a mother, chosen by a child, supported by a family, and recognized by the law. Her journey had taken her from silence and pain to justice and love. The woman once ignored by the world now had a place where she belonged. The woman once seen as a criminal was now the symbol of something bigger, a story about sacrifice, love, and second chances. Claire walked out of the courtroom with Ethan holding her hand tightly. Reporters were outside again, but this time they cheered. She didn't stop for interviews. She didn't need to. Her story had been told in full. Everything that mattered was already known. She looked down at Ethan and smiled. He smiled back. And together they walked forward, not as maid and child, not as hero and survivor, but simply as mother and son. Over time, Claire found her voice and purpose in a new way. After everything that happened, people listened when she spoke. She became a public figure, not because she wanted fame, but because her story touched so many people. Organizations invited her to speak about organ donation, medical injustice, and the need for change in healthcare systems. She talked openly about how difficult it was to watch her daughter die because she didn't have the money or access to treatment. She explained how no one should have to make illegal decisions just to save someone's life. With help from Charles, she created a non-profit organization focused on promoting organ donation and making healthcare more affordable and accessible. She didn't just speak at events. She worked behind the scenes, helping families, creating educational programs, and talking to lawmakers. Claire used her past not to feel ashamed, but to make things better for others. What had nearly destroyed her became the foundation of something powerful and lasting. Charles supported her from the start. After the trial and adoption, he took a step back from his company. He handed leadership to a trusted team and made it clear he was prioritizing his son. For years, he had hidden behind his business, using work as a shield against his emotions. But after everything that happened, he changed. He spent more time at home, not just physically, but fully present. He helped with Ethan's routines, took part in his school life, and rebuilt their relationship. At first, it was strange for him. He had spent years thinking money could solve everything. Now he realized what mattered most couldn't be bought. He also gave full financial support to Claire's nonprofit and used his influence to open doors she couldn't have opened alone. He didn't try to lead the project. He followed her lead. Charles had found redemption in becoming the father Ethan needed. The cold businessman was gone, replaced by someone softer, quieter, and more human. Ethan, who once had a life full of doctors, machines, and loneliness, grew up surrounded by love and peace. His health remained stable, and he didn't need more major treatments after the transplant. He went to school like any other child, played sports, made friends, and enjoyed a normal life. He didn't grow up in the shadow of illness or wealth, but in a home filled with laughter, routine, and emotional warmth. The mansion, once cold and silent, changed completely. Rooms that used to be empty and quiet now had drawings taped to the walls, toys on the floor, and music playing during dinner. Family meals became regular. Conversations replaced formal silence. The staff, once distant and rotating, were now part of something more stable. Claire made sure Ethan understood where he came from, what he had overcome, and how lucky they both were. Ethan knew who had saved him, not just with a kidney, but with real love. He never forgot what Claire meant to his life. Claire also never forgot her roots. Despite her new life, she remembered the hard years, the days cleaning houses for people who barely noticed her, the pain of being invisible. That memory pushed her to do more for other domestic workers. Through her organization, she launched a program that offered scholarships, training, and legal support for housekeepers and nannies across the country. Many of these women had worked in silence for years, just like Claire once had. Now they were learning, speaking, and changing their lives. Claire didn't sit in an office giving instructions. She visited them, listened to their stories, and helped them personally. She made sure her nonprofit didn't just make noise, but created real results. She believed dignity and education were not privileges, but rights. Her voice carried weight, not because she was famous, but because she had lived the struggle. She wasn't speaking for them. She was one of them, and she made sure they knew they weren't forgotten. Their story was shared again and again. It was turned into a book, written by a journalist who followed the case from the beginning. Then came a documentary showing real footage from the trial, interviews, and Claire's work afterward. Finally, a film was made. It won awards and reached international audiences. Actors played the roles, but the heart of the story was always real. People cried in theaters, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. Claire watched the movie once. She didn't enjoy seeing herself on screen. For her, it wasn't entertainment. It was a memory, painful, but also full of meaning. She didn't care about the awards or attention. She only agreed to the film because it might help someone else feel seen or feel hope. Claire's story wasn't about becoming a symbol. It was about healing, building, and making sure no one else had to fight alone the way she once did. But what truly mattered most to Claire wasn't in speeches, headlines, or awards. It was the simple mornings at home, sitting across from Ethan at the kitchen table. Every day, they had breakfast together. They talked about homework, joked about silly things, or just sat in comfortable silence. There were no machines around, no courtrooms, no fear, just peace. No one told them how to act or what to say. They had found their own rhythm, quiet and strong. Claire no longer felt afraid of losing everything. She had already lost so much once, and now she understood what was really important. The world had changed their lives, but love had rebuilt them. Two broken hearts, hers and Ethan's, had found each other, and in doing so, both had healed. In the end, that was all Claire ever wanted. Not perfection, not praise. Just this, morning light, warm food, a healthy boy, and the chance to love him every single day with no fear, no pain, and no past holding them back. At Ethan's high school graduation, the auditorium was packed. Families filled every seat, holding flowers and balloons. Teachers stood proudly near the stage. Students wore their caps and gowns, excited and nervous. When it was time for the class valedictorian to speak, all eyes turned to Ethan Whitmore. He stepped up to the podium with calm confidence. The lights above him were bright, but his eyes were focused on one place, the first row where Claire sat. She wore a simple outfit, nothing fancy, just the same kind of clothing she always wore. But to Ethan, she stood out more than anyone else in the room. He took a deep breath and began his speech. He talked about hard work, about overcoming struggles, and about the people who shape our lives. The crowd listened closely. Then his voice softened. He said, "My mother didn't just give me life. She taught me what to do with it." Claire's eyes filled with tears. The room fell completely silent for a moment. The audience responded with loud applause and standing ovations. Teachers clapped. Parents wiped their eyes. Some people didn't even know Claire personally, but they understood the weight of Ethan's words. Claire stayed seated at first, overwhelmed. Her hands shook slightly as she held the program with Ethan's name on it. The boy she once cared for in silence, in secret, now stood tall and strong, speaking with confidence and heart in front of hundreds. Ethan looked at her as if the rest of the room didn't exist. After finishing his speech, he stepped down from the stage. Without hesitation, he walked straight to her. She stood up slowly. He didn't say anything at first. He just hugged her. A long, tight hug, the kind that said everything without needing words. The cameras captured the moment. Photographers from local and national outlets were already there. Within hours, the image had spread online again. Headlines popped up. Ethan Whitmore honors his mother at graduation. The world was watching. Again. But for Claire and Ethan, the outside world didn't matter anymore. The fame, the attention, the headlines, none of it had ever been their goal. What mattered was what they shared privately. That moment between them wasn't about public approval. It was about love, about years of struggle, about quiet sacrifices that only the two of them truly understood. When they hugged, memories came flooding back. Hospital visits, bedtime stories, courtrooms, and quiet breakfasts. They had lived through it all together. And now they stood side by side, not as people rescued by luck, but as people who chose each other again and again. After the ceremony, they skipped the large celebration. They went home, made a simple dinner, and sat at the kitchen table like they always did. No decorations, no reporters, just peace. They talked about the future, about college, about simple things. The world saw a beautiful headline. But for Claire and Ethan, it was just another quiet, meaningful moment in the life they had built. Over the years, Claire had never asked for praise. She had never tried to be anything more than what she already was, a mother. She still wore her plain shoes and kept her life simple. She cooked breakfast, reminded Ethan to wear a jacket on cold mornings, and still asked if he'd eaten enough. That didn't change with media attention or awards. She stayed the same, but in the eyes of many, she had become a symbol. Not of fame, but of something stronger. Proof that family doesn't come only from blood. It comes from love, from effort, and from showing up even when things are hard. Schools told her story in classrooms. Non-profits used her example in training programs, but she never saw herself as a hero. She just saw herself as someone who made a choice and followed it through. What mattered to her wasn't being remembered by the world. What mattered was being remembered by Ethan as the one who stayed, the one who cared, the one who loved him. Ethan never forgot. Even as he got older, started thinking about college, and explored the world beyond their home, he stayed close to Claire. He often repeated something he had said since he was 6. "You did right, Mommy." He said it during quiet dinners, during birthdays, and sometimes just before heading out for the day. Each time Claire would smile, sometimes with tears in her eyes. Those 4 words were more powerful than any trophy, any title, or any amount of money. They reminded her that she had made the right decision back when everything seemed impossible. The bond between them didn't weaken with time, it only got stronger. He didn't see her as someone who saved him once. He saw her as someone who had chosen to love him every single day. That love wasn't loud, but it was steady, and it shaped the man he was becoming. And every time he said those words, it reminded her that what they had built could never be undone. Claire didn't need the world to cheer anymore. She had already received the only recognition that truly mattered. Sitting in that graduation hall with hundreds of people around her, she had only heard one voice, Ethan's. When he said, "My mother didn't just give me life. She taught me what to do with it." She felt something settle inside her, peace. Years of pain, sacrifice, and quiet endurance had led to that moment. She wasn't just the woman who once saved a boy. She was his guide, his example, his home. And when Ethan hugged her after his speech, the world faded away. She didn't see cameras or lights. She saw her son, the same little boy who once begged her to stay. Now, years later, he was still there, still choosing her. And in that final moment, when the world applauded and Ethan whispered again, "You did right, Mommy," she knew nothing else mattered. Not before, not after. That truth, their truth, would stay with them forever. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.